effective change is when you love the body you're trying to heal. When I was coming of age, I was very aware of the things that the church got wrong. And I had strong feelings about them. And I don't blame myself for that. As I've gotten older, though, I think what I better appreciate is all the things that got right, all the ways that it has supported my life, given me a sense of structure and morality and a God that loves me. And yes, it can change and evolve. Yes, it ought to. But the more you can appreciate and love what it's been and how it could be a more loving, inclusive, stronger organization, I think the more effective you can be in shaping from the inside.
Hi, I'm Amy Watkins Jensen, teacher, mother, writer, Instagrammer, and a Latter-day Saint woman committed to having respectful, unflinching conversations about women in the church. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, a renowned therapist who specializes in relationship and sexuality counseling with the Latter-day Saint community. Jennifer and I go way back. We've known each other for over 20 years. We were in sister wards in the same Chicago stake when we were both young moms. And I've been lucky to benefit from her wisdom and expertise in church settings and beyond ever since. So it felt only natural to reach out to Jennifer for her expert advice on how women in the church can navigate hard but effective conversations about their experiences, hopes, and pain points with the people in their lives. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
So I don't have a podcast. This isn't something that I normally do. But when you and I talked about the best way to offer tools to women for having respectful but unflinching conversations about the church, we both felt like a podcast format would be the most accessible and inviting. So thank you not only for your expertise, but for offering your platform to help make this happen. I'm really so grateful.
Sure. My absolute pleasure. And, not that either of us has all the answers, but maybe just starting to think about it and kind of what we've learned through the years and our own experiences and so on.
Well, I know what you say is going to be really beneficial. And I think that just talking about it is beneficial, honestly. I think one thing that you and I have both heard from a lot of Latter-day Saint women is that there's this deep desire to speak up and to share their experiences or their questions, right? And also their hopes for change. But it often comes with a real fear of conflict or fear of being misunderstood or
Yeah.
just getting dismissed.
Yes.
And I think that can be really tender, especially when those conversations are with people that we really care about, with
That's
our own
right.
family members or our friends or our church leaders. So I guess that's where I think we should start. What do you consider some strategies for having these kinds of conversations with courage and clarity? Are there tools or strategies that we can use?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much there because, first of all, I think that one of the challenges, maybe we have a couple challenges kind of out of the gate, is that part of our kind of cultural ethos is that if you are good, you don't question. On some level, you go along, you do your best, you support, you sustain, you don't doubt, you don't question. And so when something feels wrong or hurtful, it can be really easy to do one of two things: either just kind of self doubt yourself out of your voice and not speak, or get really upset, that you don't feel taken seriously, or, can kind of come in with more anger than it can be hearable at times. And so, in the invalidation or the uncertainty of whether or not we have a place at the table or in the conversation legitimately, the challenge of just regulating your own feelings about it is tricky.
Mm.
And I think if we're going to be part of a larger moral conversation about women's place in the church, is on some level, we have to believe in ourselves and the legitimacy and importance of our own perspective without demanding that others grant us that, because that's part of the challenge. You know what I mean? Like, so if you're looking for someone else to tell you your voice matters, you're going to feel more frustrated and upset and either silenced or angry. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being angry. It's just that the question is what's going to allow us to be effectual and to make a difference. So there's this piece of believing the legitimacy of our perspective without also thinking that ours is the only perspective that matters or that we see it the right way and that everybody else is getting it wrong who doesn't see it our way. There is in collaborative conversations or in important um, evolution within relationships, whether that's a marriage, a family, a church community, the ability to hold the legitimacy of your perspective while staying receptive to other points of view, and that both really matter. And so that's just a starting point, which is not a small one.
Yeah, so believing in our own perspective that it matters, that it's legitimate, and also making space for other people's perspectives and experiences. Um, yeah, that's really hard to do, right? I think
Right.
especially in this in when we're talking about it within the church structure, when we think about women as having influence, but not necessarily a seat at the table in the
Right.
same way, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So, are there ways that we can overcome that?
Well, I think first of all, giving yourself compassion that it's going to be imperfect. I remember just me as a younger person starting to speak up about things that were upsetting for me in the church, polygamy, uh, just what I experienced as women having kind of less institutional legitimacy. And speaking up in very imperfect ways, which is totally fine. That is to say, I was just starting to try to name what my experience was and why it was upsetting for me. And I guess what I have found to be the most effective thing to do is to just own your experience as your experience. That
Mm,
is to say, to non apologetically say, this is why it's been painful for me. This is what I heard when I learned about polygamy. I remember talking to my dad about it, who was kind of like, women have so much power. I don't even know what you're talking about. Right. And it was interesting to hear my dad's perspective because in many ways, he felt that was really true. Like he had been in church leadership and was the primary breadwinner and felt tremendous responsibility on himself all the time. And in some ways, like people maybe had it easier because he was trying to serve the needs of
mm.
children, a spouse, people in the church community. And so this idea that he had power like didn't really make sense to him. I think he was kind of like, what are you talking about? Like this is if anything, I feel this burden all the time. And that was helpful for me actually to just kind of hear how he experienced that. At the same time, I remember sharing with him this essay by Eloise Bell in I think the book of Thoughtful Faith, where she kind of reverses all the genders
Yeah.
and that for my dad, I think that was quite eye-opening. I said, Dad, this I think captures my experience. It's like we can't even see. It's like our Father in heaven, our Son Jesus Christ, brother and sister, president and sister. It's all men on the stand. And so Eloise Bell does this really fantastic job of just what it would be like to live in that world where everything's feminine. And then they say, on Thursday night, there's going to be a self-esteem lesson for the sweet men of the ward. And I remember my dad laughing and that and just being like, Okay, yeah, I get it. Like he never had thought of it that way before. So it's not like we got it all worked out, but I think we both also could see a little more from each other's perspective. You know, like dad, when I hear about polygamy, I think of it as there's no way that's an equal partnership. That is one woman is not enough for one man. And that has impacted my soul, and I think my dad wasn't like, "Oh, you're wrong or you're right." It was more like it was information that I think he took into his heart and understood in a different way. And I think that's how change happens. It's seldom when we're shouting picket signs at each other, right? I mean, look, change happens in many ways, but often it's in this open conversation of really trying to understand and be understood. There's
Yeah.
a kind of confidence in it and humility at the same time. Like those two go together. You're
Mm,
not disowning your experience, but you're also recognizing it's a legitimate experience, but you have a perspective too. And you're probably not crazy for seeing the world as you do. But maybe if we understand each other, we could both be a little wiser and
yeah.
more able to solve things. Mhm.
So, in your experience, is it usually a series of conversations versus a, one and done, now everybody understands everybody's situation and perspective, or can it also happen quickly?
I think it depends a lot. I mean, I would say for sure it's a series of conversations. It's valuing being receptive, it's valuing the process of collaboration. If you look through history at the ways that things have changed, it's often been through a sort of deep persistence over time.
Yeah.
And like the civil rights era, I think it's just, and I think the most effective change is when you love the body you're trying to heal. That is, that you care about it enough. You know, when I was coming of age, I was very aware of the things that the church got wrong. And I had strong feelings about them. And I don't blame myself for that. As I've gotten older, though, I think what I better appreciate is all the things that got right, all the ways that it has supported my life, given me a sense of structure and morality and a God that loves me. And yes, it can change and evolve. Yes, it ought to. But it's like the more you can appreciate and love what it's been and how it could be a more loving, inclusive, stronger organization, I think the more effective you can be in shaping from the inside.
Hmm. I think that's so interesting and so many because in my own experience, um, I think that often what gets misunderstood when women do speak up and speak
Yeah,
out is that we're trying to tear something down. But in
definitely.
reality, it's that we wanna bring our full selves to the body of Christ. In reality,
Mhm.
it's we wanna make more room and more space for more generations of women and men to stay and thrive and flourish in a way that we know is possible.
Mhm.
So to me, I always think of it as I have this really strong belief and testimony of the importance of my church life and how it has changed me and how I've benefited from my church life and my spiritual life and my spiritual home as a Latter-day Saint. And I think that's part of the pain point is
Yeah.
that often we feel dismissed or misunderstood as wanting to tear things down when in reality it's the motivation is love. And so I
Yeah.
think that can be really hard to sit with.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the more that it can be 100%. And I think that the mixture of feelings about this, of anger, of frustration, it's all part of the process. I think that the more we can speak to our shared values, because
Yeah.
what I think often happens is in these conversations, we get very aware of the differences in our perspectives rather than, we see it in politics as well. Like we're very, very aware of how we're different than the other side rather than how most Americans want the same things.
Right.
And so it's very easy to get into conversations that are about where you disagree rather than what is the higher thing we're actually aiming for. We want our children to feel accepted. We want our daughters to understand their value and the importance of their perspective. We want a community that's strengthened by having the ability to bring the gifts of everyone to the body of Christ. So the more we can speak to what most of us actually desire, the more we can sort out how do we do that.
Yeah.
The more we get locked down in this is how it must look, or this is what I'm terrified of letting go of, the more we tend to get gridlocked and frustrated. I think there's something else that as I've gotten older, I've come to maybe appreciate more too, is the fundamental tension that exists between tradition and change, and how that is difficult because oftentimes we feel like things don't change as fast as we wish they would, but that there is a lot of wisdom in that tension because tradition tends to hold. I mean, tradition, of course, when you go too extreme in change or tradition, they become toxic.
Yeah.
But in the tension of those two, it's like justice and mercy. There's wisdom in both realities. And so respecting it more, I think helps you go a little less crazy. Like just
Totally.
respect that we're in a process. It's always going to be flawed. It's never
Yeah.
going to be fast. And change probably should not be fast.
Hmm.
I mean, we need time to figure out what's really wise and what's really best.
Oh, I love that. We need time to find what's really wise and what's really best. And in the meantime, understanding that tension, it's funny because I've been doing a lot of thinking myself on not just tension, but friction,
Yeah.
right? And the friction, tension sometimes makes me feel like it's just two opposite forces pulling apart and we're never going to find common
Right.
ground.
Mm,
But what happens in that tension is that often it creates friction. And
that's
friction is what we need to move forward, right? That's always going
yeah.
to be the case. And I'm a person that needs to think in metaphor. That's just how my brain
Yeah.
works. And I
Yeah.
thought I keep thinking over and over again of growing up in Chicago, and there was this pond in my neighborhood that would freeze over, and all of the neighborhood kids, we'd wait for that pond to freeze over because we love to get on our skates and we love to go play around and pretend we were ice skaters and learn how to do arabesques and do all kinds of crazy stuff, or you know push around a hockey puck or whatever it was. And I remember one day I was coming home from church and I had penny loafers on. And I saw that the neighborhood kids were out there playing. And I was like, whoa, not without me, you don't. And I run out there with penny loafers that have the least amount of friction possible on a shoe. And I
Right.
mean, it was comical. I looked like one of those cartoon characters just trying to find purchase, and just my legs are flying everywhere. And, it was just hilarious. And I, ended up with nothing but just like a bruised bum. And I get off and I'm like kind of crawling off and I run into the house and get my skates. And I can put those skates on. And it's that metal that bites in,
Right.
right? It's that friction that bites into that smooth surface, that ice, that makes you move forward, that makes
Yeah.
it
100%.
possible to like practice that clumsy arabesque.
Right.
And I think that so often in the church, we really are scared of friction.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just
In our
doesn't
culture, we are too. Yeah.
in our culture, right, totally,
Mm,
and, one thing influences the other, and it just feels like contention is bad,
yeah.
and I think we label things that are contention that are not
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
contention. It's friction that is meant for peacemaking. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
friction
Yeah.
that's meant
Right.
for finding those most the wise and best things that will help us move forward, and so
100%. And I mean, when I mean the culture, I mean the larger culture too. Like we
sure.
have a lot more focus on kids never feeling unheard or, like, and I appreciate all those things, right? But in some ways, we've reduced the friction so much that we don't have the pressure points that build capacity. So I sometimes think about like my own growing up in the church. It was often these places of invalidation, frustration, not being at peace with something while there were other things that felt very right for me.
Mm,
Those are the places that pushed me to develop capacity in myself, in my soul,
mm,
to be able to speak about what I actually thought. And I think at the time, I just thought of that friction as negative rather than it's valuable. It helps you develop muscle capacity, discern what you think and feel. I think we imagine sometimes, and this is not to get away from our ideals. Like I think, the healthier our churches, the better for us. And it's a valuable endeavor to love it and to watch it, to facilitate it growing. But I think that it's also true that we live in a deeply imperfect world. And sometimes it's living in that imperfection that we develop spiritual capacity, we develop more self confidence, we develop our own moral compass when we can't get the validation that we want from our group. I guess what I'm better see in my life is how deeply imperfect life is.
Yeah.
And that it's how we respond in that has so much to do with our own spirituality.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, oh, it's all how it should be. Don't worry about it. I don't mean that. I mean, being able to figure out, what do I really believe is good? What do I believe would make this community stronger? What do I need to speak honestly and humbly about? Humble in the sense that I don't have all the answers, but I do believe this. I do see this as a problem. This has a negative impact on me, on others. How can we do this better? Because I
Yeah.
think that when we're coming from that perspective, we can tolerate the frustration more. But I think we are understood as not trying to tear something down. So, I mean, obviously you're going to be misunderstood, right? There are
Yeah.
people that are just afraid of all change. And so they'll see any voice of dissent as a destructive one. But I think caring about the entity that we want to see grow, it matters for our own spiritual development and for the group.
Yeah, I think that the reality of it being this not quick fix, it's gonna take many conversations, and we need to enter those conversations humbly, and we need to enter them knowing that our voice matters, having a conviction that the change we are asking for is going to be beneficial to our community, to all the people that surround us, that, that takes a lot of fortitude. It takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of grit, and sometimes that's a lot of emotional labor too.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what's hard about understanding the long haul
Yeah.
part of it, right? Is like is that we're even when we are convinced of our own, we're entering spaces humbly and we know that change needs to happen for, good, and we're willing to come to the table with collaboration, and we want to hear, we want to be curious. That's a lot to ask of
Yes.
women. And so how do we take care of ourselves? How do we navigate that emotional labor?
Yeah.
Advocating for change in a church that often resists it. Like, how do we take our care of ourselves in that?
What I guess I would say is it's not that it is as it is supposed to be. So that is to say, it's
Mm,
not like this is women's lot and you have to do this and you just need to have a good attitude. I think the way I would think about it more is this is what it is. This is how things are currently. And I have a choice to make, right? To step in and do this work, not because there's any guarantee that it will have any effect, not because I know that it will change anything, but because it matters to me enough to speak up, to articulate what I see as a problem, because I care about this problem enough to invest my emotional energy here or not, right? Like, and the reason I say it that way is because um, we're placed in this reality, but we do have choices about how we're going to relate to it. And I
mm,
just think that's really, really important because when we do hard things, having a sense of our agency in it is really critical to sustaining ourselves and reminding ourselves we don't have to fight that fight. We don't have to do it. We don't even have to stay participating in the church, right? We have real choices. But when we can decide what matters to us and what we want to do with our energy, I think then we find a deeper source within ourselves rather than looking for it in validation outside of ourselves. Because when you're trying to change something, that validation is in short supply
mm.
and
No,
not being shocked by that fact.
yeah, that's so gosh, that's so true. Um, I talk to women so often about their experiences in the church, speaking up and speaking out. And I think that even when we understand that we're entering that space in a way that because we're using our agency, and even when we're doing quote unquote all the right things, we have all the right intentions, we also are protecting ourselves. That it's impossible to do all the right things, and sometimes conversations will end in contention or with somebody dismissing you.
Yeah.
And I'd love you to speak to this very specific example because I'm hearing it so often right now when women that you care for dismiss you,
Mm.
and how painful that is. And I'll give you just a quick example in my own life. Maybe that will kind of help ground
Uh,
this, but I have a dear friend, somebody I have known for honestly, I've known her since I was 12 years old, and we have gone through so much together. And I understand her, and she understands me in ways that I think very few humans do. And yet, when I came to her with some pain about something that was happening to me in my church life and how I was trying to advocate for change in that, her answer to me was, "Oh, Amy, bless your heart. I just wish you
mm,
understood how much the prophet loves you." And
mm,
I thought, "What? Oh, we weren't talking about the prophet. I was talking about something that was happening locally."
mhm,
And I just realized that I couldn't penetrate this wall that she had up where she felt like I was trying to advocate for change or express my hurt in the situation, that
mhm,
somehow I was not following the prophet.
mhm,
And I didn't
mhm.
know how to react in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so one thing I would say is that I imagine her response is a reaction to her own fear.
Mm,
I don't know exactly, but what I can imagine is that she sees you doing something dangerous, like you're
mm,
challenging something that she holds dear, and she's afraid that it's challenging the authority of what she holds dear. And so her way of coping with it is to just kind of patronize you. The other aspect of it is also that she probably hasn't experienced this, or she hasn't experienced it or made sense of it in the way that you are. But she's also not open and curious to how it's different. She's kind of putting it in a box and saying, you know, I wish you got it. I wish you got things the way that they really are. So it's it's a very human response. When we feel threatened, we tend
mm.
to be dismissive and stereotype another person rather than being open and understanding them and having our own view get challenged or expanded, right? So I think it helps to at least understand on some level or imagine that this is about managing their own fear.
Mm,
What I also think a fair response can be is to, in the language that I often teach, is to get more intimate. And by intimate, what I mean is I'm not trying to change you, but I'm willing to show you who I am and even what your impact is on me. Right. And so it's not about trying to shame them or get them to see it your way. And you have to be really careful about this because that's so much our human instinct. But it's more about, hey, like, that's hard for me when you say that because I also love the prophet. Like, and I'm not, I feel that you're dismissing something that really matters to me. Right. And I'm not saying that it needs to matter to you or that you need to see it the same way, but that is painful for me. Right. So it's just like revealing the underbelly a little bit.
mm,
Uh, It's hard to be dismissed by you, my friend. Right.
mm.
I'm not asking you to see it the same way or even agree with me, but to put it in a box of not caring or not seeing things as they actually are, that's hard.
Yeah. Do you think that I think that's really smart and really beautiful actually, to just say, instead of, because I think naturally what I think I'd do is close myself off and just say, "She's not gonna get it. She doesn't care about what I care about. She doesn't wanna know me or hear me in this moment." And so taking that extra step of saying, "Well, you know, that reaction hurts me, and can I tell you why? And offering that, I think that's really beautiful. Do you think that that same kind of language works or would work when we're talking to male leadership in our local spaces, in our local wards
Well,
and stakes?
one thing I would say is that the idea of anything working, probably you have to let go of.
Okay, that's fair,
Because,
fair.
that is to say, like, we only have limited control,
Yeah,
and the most we can control is who we are in a certain moment and how we handle ourselves in the face of invalidation. But I think there's ways that increase the likelihood of understanding, and there's ways that decrease the likelihood of understanding. When we wall off and say, forget it, they'll never get it, and I'm just going to add just a little layer of hatred between you and me because I
mm,
feel angry at you. Again, human response. I do it all the time. Okay. Like, I mean, it's not like it's a very, very easy thing to do. Um, that is a lot, takes a lot less courage than being willing to care about that person enough to stay in an honest, invalidating conversation. And by invalidating, what I mean by that is that you're opening up the possibility of more truth between you, as in more understanding of two different perspectives. That tends to be what grows relationships up, grows couples up in a marriage, grows families up. It's facilitating more shared understanding. And what our natural man thing to do is to kind of entrench in our perspective, find people that validate our perspective,
yeah,
and kind of stay locked in. But while it feels good, right? Because I think hatred feels good. And I don't mean that you're being hateful. I just mean we can just do a little bit of rejecting and kind of feel a little self righteous energy. It feels
mm,
better than going into the vulnerability of saying, that's hard for me. Right. And
yeah,
I feel patronized. Okay. Or, um, or even I fear that you might be right and I might be wrong, but I feel compelled to speak about it. Right. Like even that, I think that it makes it more likely that they don't entrench in their own justification and wall and a little bit of hatred and instead think like, okay, I know Amy, she's not trying to destroy anything. And maybe she's got a point about that. Maybe that isn't the best way to handle something. Meaning she's starting to understand how you see things. And when we have more complexity, we're more able to solve problems.
yeah.
When we think in our simple-minded ways, the perspective that we know, we don't come up with good solutions.
Yeah, I think it can be especially hard when we're talking to male leadership because there's this power differential, right? Where that person doesn't have to listen, right? That person can make decisions
Yeah.
without my input. That person is in a position where they can be understanding that partnership is beneficial to them, right? And collaboration is beneficial, but they don't have to come do it from that perspective. You know, it's like anything in the church and probably anything in the world, it sort of depends on who that person is, right? It depends on who the person you're talking to. So it's hard to say, like, well, this is what you should do in this situation because it's going to be so different. But I'm wondering if what you said in the beginning about your father and his sort of being able to understand a little bit about where you are coming from, and also you being able to open up your heart and mind to his
That's right.
um, labor and the things that he is responsible for and how that must weigh on him. I'm wondering if that's also a beneficial way of looking at things when we're talking to our male leadership and our wards and stakes because they do have a lot on their plate and the system often doesn't benefit them either. So how do we find compassion for their position without it being so compassionate that we just say, well, I don't want to bother them anymore,
Well,
like they
because
have too
I don't
much.
think that is compassionate.
Mhm.
I don't think if we really, how to say it, too often we think not speaking up is what it means to sustain. Too often
Mhm.
we think not speaking truthfully is what it is to be loyal or invested in something. But I actually think when I work with couples and they really get more deeply invested in the marriage thriving, they get more honest. They get
Right.
more willing to take the risk of having hard conversations, invalidating ones, ones that create feelings, okay, like as in, or make those feelings come more to the surface, because that is the process of making something stronger.
Mm,
When we just say, like, I'm just not going to make any waves because I just don't want to deal with the discomfort of that, that's a disinvestment in something
yeah.
thriving. Now, I don't mean that there aren't times when you might decide, you know what, I just don't think my point of view on this right now is that important. And that's just coming out of a place of wisdom or good judgment, right? But there's often times when our perspective really, really does matter. And that the invalidation of it matters. Again, there is no such thing as something working. That is to say, you have different leaders, you have different maturity in those leaders, right? Like some people that are in a good marriage, right? Okay, that male leader he already understands about the equality of women. He already understands the importance of collaboration because that's why he's in a
Yeah.
good marriage. Okay. And so it's going to be more intuitive for him than somebody who thinks relationships are about obedience and compliance. They're going to have a harder time with a dissident voice. Nonetheless, the way people grow is through more friction. That
Yeah.
is, when the way they want things to be doesn't turn out to be the way things are, that's when people are more able to evolve into higher order thinking. It doesn't mean they will, it just means that they can. And sometimes being a part of the friction is the kindest thing you can do. You don't want it to be hateful. Okay. A lot of times we talk about contention, right? I'm going to say, yeah, contention is of the devil because there's got hatred
Yeah.
in it. But conflict, that's divine. Okay. We need
Yeah.
conflict to grow. That's just two honest perspectives. And if you don't have that, if you don't have varying points of view, you're going to be stupid. That is, you're going to be too limited in what is actually happening to make the best possible choice. And so when we limit women's voices, we limit the intelligence of the leadership. That is, we are literally limiting our ability to solve. And so the better we get at collaborating, the stronger we get. And collaboration is unilateral. You don't have to get someone to agree with you. Collaboration is to speak honestly, to do your part for the good of the group. I can't control whether or not you receive it. I can't control whether or not you take it seriously, but I can control whether or not I speak, whether or not I share my perspective and how I do it. And so it's not waiting for someone else to say it's okay to speak towards our desire for the group to be stronger. That's already our moral calling.
Interesting. It makes me think of something that just happened to me recently. And I hear this all the time from women and from men in the church where, you know, they are sort of the designated person in their Sunday school class to sort of raise their hand and say, but what about, or I'm not sure, or here's a different perspective.
Yeah.
And then afterwards,
People are like, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah.
thank you so much. And then you're like, oh my gosh, why am I the one that's always doing this? And somehow you have become that person and you sort of have to accept that that's the role
Mhm.
that you have probably walked into yourself by doing it, right?
Yeah.
But but the flip side of that, which is something I didn't understand until really recently, is that I'm getting different feedback than the bishop is. And
Mm,
that's not fair,
mm,
right? Or that the other leadership is getting. Because if I'm hearing, thank you for saying that, and I know that there's like all these people in my ward who are depending on this other voice,
right.
and I'm getting that feedback,
That's
and
right.
then I'm not taking that feedback and taking it to the bishop,
Right. Right.
then it's not a collaborative effort,
That's right. That's
right?
right.
And then I have sort of made it so that we can't go forward in ways that we need to in our ward because I'm not sharing the voices of all these people who I've all of a sudden become,
Yeah.
representative of unintentionally. And the other part of that is that the bishop might be getting totally different feedback back than I'm getting because it's all the people who are annoyed that I'm saying all these things,
Right.
right?
Right.
Going to the bishop. And so there's this contention created because we're not talking about it, because we're not collaborating, because I'm not sitting down with the bishop and saying, hey, here's what I'm hearing. What are you hearing about this?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, so I think, one of the biggest challenges in human conflict is that we tend to want approval. We want people that think the same way. We we tend to shy away from honest conflict. And by honest, I don't mean going in and being attacking, okay? Because some people, they kind of like that. They like the superiority they get from being accusing or attacking. But I mean, like, really going into an honest conversation of difference takes some internal capacity that is not easy. So it's much
Mm.
easier to sneak over to Amy after class and say, "Thanks so much for saying that. I totally couldn't agree more." But I don't want to go say it to my spouse or the bishop or somebody else, because then now they're going to think I'm like Amy, and who wants to be like Amy?
Really? Who does?
But, and so they want the validation, but they also want kind of you to take it on rather than tolerate their own conflict. Or the people that disagree with you may also be going and talking to the bishop. So what's happening is people are creating teams that feels good, but actually can interfere with progress. It gets more combative and there's less understanding. And the thing I find, when you get people to start speaking really honestly and they're really just trying to understand and then be understood, I mean, people just tend to be like, "Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense." Like, I mean, that is if we can settle our egos down a tiny bit and better understand why someone is threatened by that, why that feels scary to them, why that feels like a bad idea, that, you can at least have a little more compassion. And they're not just against you. They have something they're afraid of, or they have a legitimate concern about why that might not work well. And it really helps if people will do the hard work of coming together. But because it doesn't feel good, I teach this all the time, and I still hate it. I'm not, I don't like having invalidating conversation, but that's where people grow up and that's where people
Yeah.
get here.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's also where we allow ourselves to participate. Because I think that the other thing that happens in my experience is that there's many people who have just given up and who just are in the pews for lots of different reasons, but not because they feel like they can fully bring themselves to the work. And so
Yeah.
apathy sets in,
Yeah.
right? And that's also so damaging to a ward health,
Yeah.
right? Or to a church health or a community health. I hear this all the time from women who just say, I've given up. I
Yeah.
have to be in this because it's going to be bad for my marriage if I don't go to church, but I'm going to take my talents and real energy outside of
Yeah, no,
my
it's
faith community.
tragedy. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, that does happen a lot. And it's an understandable response. If people feel like I don't have enough effect, I don't want to be frustrated all the time, and I'm just disinvesting as a way of coping. And I see this happen all the time in marriages. Like, well, we're not going to divorce, but we're not going to keep trying either,
Mm.
because it's too much pain and it's too much work. And I'm just not sure we'll ever get to a good marriage. So I'm not divorcing, but the marriage is dead. And again, I'm not here to say where people need to invest their energy, actually, and or what's right for people, because for some people that is the best of all choices, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I totally agree with you that we really lose something when people are so lonely right now in society, and they're looking for a place to belong. They're looking for a sense of purpose, and we have the possibility of cultivating more of that in our ward communities. And so, but it's an understandable response. I think it's also an act of love to invest in making your ward a better ward, a better community, a more inclusive one, finding ways to do that even in non-official ways, but
Yeah.
like trying to create more understanding, create more opportunities to care about differences and different perspectives and experiences and needs. I teach a women's course called The Art of Desire,
Mm.
and teach couples courses and things. And when I'm at these live events, people, especially the women's event, people often comment that they feel so close to the other women and that they miss that at church, that they really like don't feel that at church. I often say to that, that's because here you feel like you can be honest, but at church we often collude in being quiet, not saying what we think, not sharing our real experience and our real lives. And then we invite the same from other people. Like if we're only showing where we agree, we invite other people to only show where they agree. Or when we don't speak about our real experience, but we're telling people how they should think, we invite the same from others. And so, one way to invest in your ward community is to just bring more of your honest self to it. So, like, I think a great way to speak up in church meetings is not about this is why I have an issue with this policy or this way of doing it. I mean, you can say that. Okay. I'm not saying you can't, of course. But I also think it's more effective to say, this is why this idea is painful for me. This is why it's been hard for me to find resonance with this way of thinking about this because it's hard to argue with, first of all. And if you're sharing that it's had an impact on me and it's real, right? You're not just trying to manipulate people, you're talking about your real experience or the real experience of someone you love,
Hmm.
can resonate with that. They're human too. They know that feeling. And so it validates their humanity, the legitimacy of their pain point. And also it just makes it like, okay, well, I don't have to be perfect. She just talked about how imperfect her life is. It allows people to care about each other more and feel more that they belong.
Yeah.
I think sometimes our focus on the fact that, that we're the true gospel can be we can make it so that there can't be disagreement or we can't think things are ever wrong or we can't say things like, "I really don't enjoy reading the scriptures," or something like that. We think, "Oh, we can't say that," and because we're showing that something's imperfect or that we're not getting with the program. And I think when we do that to ourselves, we limit the ability of our community to grow, to be real, to be a place of belonging, and to grow into something that's stronger, that's just better because it's embracing the whole body.
Yeah. Gosh, it's such a tragedy to think about women who inherit this or opt in, right, to this space that could be so rich with belonging
Yeah.
and is for so many women at different, and gosh, I just love Relief Society. I know I'm one of those people, it's like people are like, "Well, you love" I love Relief Society. I have loved my Relief Society experience and all the different wards that I've been in, that I've lived in throughout the world, and I think that's such a tragedy that there's this possibility for real connection and real belonging and real work to do together, shoulder to shoulder, that we're missing out on because we're trying to show up in ways that are not authentic.
In the North Shore First Word, a
Yeah.
couple of friends and we made an agreement. This was maybe like 7 years ago of like just to start speaking more honestly in Relief Society, just like more like genuinely about things that were hard, things that we were going through. And so it was three of us. It wasn't just one of us doing it. And I'm telling you that the feeling of that Relief Society shifted. Like
Mm.
there was a woman who spoke, I never would have thought it. She spoke up about how lonely she felt, how she didn't really feel she had a friend in the ward. And she wasn't saying it like poor me. She was just openly sharing that this had really been a struggle for her. And I was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Like, invited her over for dinner, just like, because now I could see it. I could never have seen it before because her life just looked so together and just never would have assumed she ever felt lonely. It was this things like that where it just got more real. And I felt like the release study literally became closer to each other. And I'm not trying to say it was all just the three of us. It was just like that somehow something shifted in the energy of that group. And I think that how we show up there makes a difference.
Oh my gosh, I love this so much. I think this is an experiment that really could happen in any ward, right? Like, find a couple of friends who you just agree that we're just gonna be more honest. And
Yeah.
I do think that that will inevitably give permission to
Right.
others to be more honest. And then we can find compassion for each other, right? We can find connection and we can find belonging. I think that what happens is that we think like, "Oh, well, you know, Jennifer can do it because Jennifer is a therapist and she's brave." But if it's just one person or like Amy, she's a loudmouth, so what of course she's going to do
Yeah.
it, you know? But if
Right.
it's more than if it's 3, right? Or 4
Right.
women and not necessarily the ones who are always saying those things, I
Um,
really do think gosh, what a beautiful experiment that could be to
yeah.
spread across the church right now. Let's just find some people who are just saying in our own relief societies in that safe space. It should be a safe space for us. It's a female space. It's a woman's space. I wish it were a more inclusive space in so many ways,
Yeah.
right? I wish that that sense of belonging could be extended further, but how do we do that if we're not willing to do it in our own words, right? So yeah,
Exactly.
that's beautiful. Thank you for that. I'm
Yeah.
inspired. I'm finding 2 friends right now.
That's good. That's good. I think, yeah, it really it comes from, I guess it's just kind of coming into my head more. It's just that this really is about coming from inside of us rather than looking outside of us for permission. It's when we're looking outside for permission that we get stuck and frustrated. And the
Yeah.
more we can claim, like, I can speak honestly, I have a legitimate, like, even to start talking about our failures or hard things, it's to self validate that I'm a legitimate person and I'm having a painful time right now about something, right? That just takes a certain strength. We tend to think of it as weak if somebody's talking about something hard in their life, but it's strong people that can talk about hard things and not feel ashamed or that they have to protect how they're seen by others. And just normalizing we're human, we're in this together in this flawed, imperfect world, and we can love each other. I mean, that's just the gospel right there. And we have that in our power. And I'm not dismissing structural issues, ways that there are people that really don't feel included, that desperately need to belong, right? And that is all true. But the power of love is remarkable. And
Mm,
I think we need to claim that more deeply in ourselves.
yeah. I think that says it all, right? The power of love is remarkable. And I think that that is a good thing to keep in mind when we're having these hard conversations, is that not only is it because we love the church or we love our experience or we love, and we care deeply about our community, but having self-love in that moment and love for our neighbors sitting next to us in the pews and all of that matters if we can look through it that lens of love when we're having those conversations. And love for the person who might really disagree with us or might be really, really ticked off that we just keep on wanting to
Yeah.
have these hard conversations, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah, I
Yeah.
think
Right.
that's a really that's the lens we probably should be looking through when we're talking about all of this. So yeah.
Yeah, I can't think of his name right now, but when I was at Restore, the Faith Matters conference last
Mhm.
fall, John, I can't remember his full name, but he is a gay man who decided
Oh,
to go
right.
back to church like in the early 2000s. And he just
Yeah.
felt called to do it, even though, there were people in his ward who were adamantly against even just the fact that he was there. And he just kept going
Yeah.
and kept caring despite feeling really uncared about. And, he's telling his story. I'm like, dang, if he can do that, like that, that is to love. And, and he felt called to do it. I'm not saying everybody needs to do what he does, right? But he just felt like being there, being who I am, caring about the people around me is the most important thing. And he told a story of someone in the ward who deeply disagreed with him being there, was telling the bishop that he shouldn't be there and so on. And the bishop, in his wisdom, assigned this man who was hateful
Mm.
John, I think that's his first name, that he like actually became his home teacher or something like that. And when he was
Mm,
sick, he came over and gave him a blessing, and then just something melted away, something changed. And that's just powerful change. I mean, you really change the hearts and minds of people by just being there, being real, and caring about them, and being the different soul that you are is powerful stuff. Much,
powerful.
much more than letters on a sign. I mean, to really change how someone sees the world. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think that that is such a great example of the fact that it's not about agreement,
that's
right? It's not even about getting everyone on the same page. It's about helping bring love in whatever way we can. And
yeah,
and I think that what you're saying about him feeling called to that is also an important piece of it because so often we feel called
that's
to
right.
speak up and speak out or to act. And it is something that comes from God, and we choose to co-create with God when we answer that
Yeah,
call. So that also sustains in
it
a
does.
way that is,
Yeah, you're
when people ask me, like, "How can you talk to so many women and feel their pain?" Or, "How can you keep doing what you're doing?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. I just feel like I must."
yes,
And and I think that there's an element of that too, of, like, doing
100%.
what God's asking you to do. What is God asking you to co-create with heavenly parents?
Yeah,
And, I think that should also come into our thinking when we're having these hard conversations. What are we being called to do? What are we being called to
right.
hear? What are we being called to say?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I don't wanna take any more of your time. This has been such a beautiful conversation for me personally, and I'm so grateful to you and for your friendship and for all that you do for Latter-day Saint women. So thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Amy. Really, it was a pleasure. So good to
Thank
connect with
you.
you again.